Hey, man, we're back with another banger, man. YouTube, I said we're back with another banger. Hey.
So, straying away from the chaos that just occurred, I'm Adrianna, Kalinich, senior at Tabor Academy, student of Dr. Kniesler in AT Multi-Genre Literature E-Block class. Today, we're looking at Love Medicine by Louise Erdrich. Basically, this novel highlights a multiple of short stories from a Native author. These stories are fiction, but they still provide somewhat of a good insight on Native culture, what it's like, what life is like on the res. It's important to also acknowledge the assimilation that comes into play with this idea of white Catholicism onto Native culture. So throughout this book, Erdrich really, her implication of Catholicism with the Ojibwe culture is, it acts as a symbolic representation of the historical white colonization and attempted cultural assimilation of Native populations, which illustrates the enduring impact of religious imposition on Indigenous identity and communal resilience in the face of cultural erasure. So, for some context, previously in American society and American culture, Americans are colonizers. We know this. This is kind of known facts. And when the European colonizers came to America, there were already Native people living here. And essentially, these colonizers did not only bring disease, but they brought their cultural and religious practices as well. And there was kind of this idea of exceptionalism amongst them, which they thought they needed to spread to the Native culture. They assumed these Native people were savages, they were uncivilized, and that Christianity could basically be their salvation and could basically modernize Native culture. So a lot of this cultural erasure also stemmed from these boarding schools, these Indian boarding schools, also known as residential schools. So residential schools were established from the mid-17th to the early 20th century, and the primary objective was to civilize or assimilate Native children into Western culture. And you can obviously see how problematic this is, because you're taking children involuntarily out of their homes and placing them in boarding schools away from their parents, away from their families, taking them off the reservation, which is all they've known all their life, and placing them in this westernized society where beatings were normal. There were reports of dead children, things like that. Like physical, emotional, mental abuse was something that these schools did not shy away from. And we actually have multiple accounts in Love Medicine of specifically two of these Native characters experiencing this boarding school, residential school life. First off, we have Nectar Cashball, who is one of the main characters in this story, and he is basically just a Native boy on the reservation, well-known, born into a well-known Native family, things like that. But on page 61 of this book, he talks about like his experience about getting sent to this boarding school. And basically it says, quote, "Because I got sent to school, I'm the one who always walks into town and sells what we shoot. I get prices from the sisters who cook for the priests, and then I come home and split the money in half." So this specific quote actually involves both that idea of Christianity and Catholicism and how that affects like Ojibwe culture, and this also really shows that idea that he was not in any way, shape, or form asked oh, would you like to go to this school? It was very much forced on him, very much placed on him. And so our second character in Love Medicine who we see who gets sent away to boarding school is Lulu Lamartine, or Nana Push. And basically Lulu, similar to Nectar, grew up on the res. So she talks about like her experience, which was on page 276 of Love Medicine, and she's, quote, "It was just that time of summer before school starts, before the leaves turn yellow and fall off overnight, before I would have to get on the government bus and go off to boarding school. Some children never did come home, I'd heard." Basically, similarly to Nectar's story, you had one way to go, and she was forced on that path, and there was no option to stray off on her own, to do what she would like to do. No. This was forced on basically almost every Native children on the reservation. It's even coming to light recently in recent articles. I read an article in The Atlantic talking about how there were like multiple bodies and like skeletons and remains of children have been found in these residential schools. There are still residential schools in practice today. Lulu also talks about her experiences with trying to run away and escape from these boarding schools in this residential school. She basically talks about being forced to wear, quote, "a hot orange shame dress." And this basically just reinforces the idea that American society at this point in time, and similar to how prisoners have to wear orange jumpsuits, I think that is really symbolic to the way that they viewed these children and the purpose of this school. The school wasn't necessarily to educate to and in any way better these kids for American society, or to better them to be more productive members of society. It was, in a sense, to impose this idea of American exceptionalism, and they really viewed these Native children as prisoners, as people who they could enforce their will upon, as people who have no rights, no say. What the school says goes, and that's it. And I think that that's super interesting because these are just children, and these are children who did nothing wrong, innocent children. So the fact that this ideal can even be enforced, just, it goes to show the absolute tyranny that was happening in these schools. So throughout Love Medicine, there are multiple. Specifically, I want to touch on Marie. She's too white for the natives and too natives for the whites. So she's kind of stuck in this crossroads. And she really only finds solace in this Catholic community. It's interesting to note that because Marie's half white, she's kind of distant from that culture, that Native culture already. And so instead of seeking solace in her Native community, she goes and seeks it with Catholicism. Marie says, quote, "I was going up there on the hill with the black robe women. They were not any lighter than me. I was going up there to pray as good as they could because I don't have much Indian blood, and they never thought they'd have a girl from this reservation as a saint they'd have to kneel to." And this idea of maybe whitewashing and, again, cultural erasure, as instead of going back to her Native roots, she finds herself more drawn to the Catholics. Essentially, this quote really depicts this sense of cultural erasure in the Native community due to Catholicism. It just really shows Marie, specifically her connection with the Catholic community rather than her own Native culture. It really reflects the idea that due to various historical and societal pressures, that Native individuals would rather connect with Catholicism rather than their own personal cultural identity. So the stereotype that has been instilled in her through media, through the way that she interacts with people, through societal norms, that her native culture is more inferior. So ultimately, Marie's belief that she has to distance herself from her native culture to be accepted or respected within the Catholic community really exemplifies the erasure of indigenous culture within the broader aspect of societal norms. Marie says, quote, "I was like those little bush Indians who stole the holy black hat of a Jesuit and swallowed little scraps of it to cure their fevers. But the hat itself carried smallpox and was killing them with belief." The metaphorical representation of colonialism in this quote, the reference to those bush Indians who steal the Jesuits' holy black hat serves as a metaphor for like broader historical context. This holy black hat symbolizes the religious and cultural artifacts brought by the European colonizers, which represents this like idea of foreign beliefs and practices on indigenous societies. Swallowing scraps was not like physically swallowing the scraps of a hat, but rather emotionally and mentally swallowing and internalizing Western ideologies and Western culture, following these ideas and ideals that their culture is going to diminish day by day, week by week, generation by generation. This reference to smallpox and the destruction that that caused really demonstrates the destructive nature of colonialism and assimilation, because essentially it's destroying a whole culture, a whole cultural identity, cultural practices, religious practices. Rich really portrays this erasure of native culture and the enduring effects of colonialism, and specifically these residential Indian boarding schools. And throughout her storytelling and nuanced characterization, Erdrich highlights these profound challenges faced by Indigenous people and Native people in reclaiming and preserving their cultural heritage, their cultural identities, their religious practices, all in the wake of systematic oppression. This novel is really a testament to the resilience and strength of the Native community, and it offers an insight into the complexities of identity, belonging, and cultural survival.